He illustrates for us the arbitrariness of the kind of separations that are created by defining things. So that when we define something as separate from something else, we create limits to our ability to see the interrelationships and the dynamics of those interrelationships. So that is why Gregory also liked to quote Blake in saying, "Madmen see outlines, and therefore they draw them."
And then there are the people who are the real scientists, and they see, I didn't draw this one very well, but there is an imaginary line, and which, if it were drawn properly, defines various, well, limits. These are scientists. You see, they look for a relation which isn't really there, in terms of which they will describe this thing. All right, now, you see, what's reality? These people are not in disagreement about the figure. Nobody ever mentions, of course, that it's a figure done in chalk on a blackboard. That it's made of this funny white stuff. I've never had one mention that. Indeed, I think only a psychotic would do that. You know, they're the ones who say the ink blot looks like a blot of ink. This is very sick. On the whole, we can get a certain amount of agreement, you know, about what's really there, but we cannot get agreement about ways of describing it, and we use in the description a whole mass of concepts of intervening variables and mentionables to get our stuff across.
We have been trained to think in ways we hardly notice. Religion, education, and culture all filter and frame our perception.
If I'm of the belief, for instance, that that there really is some object, there really is objectivity to the fullest extent, and that actually would mean that that coffee cup on the table is being rendered identically in your head as mine. And we know now, even with fMRIs, that is just not the case. And for us to believe it's really the same thing, and for us to argue, is pointless. It's absolutely pointless. The way you make sense of that coffee cup and the way I make sense of that coffee cup, different. But it's still a coffee cup. And I think that we'd have a little more peaceful earth, really, if we had that perspective, that I would respect the fact that you have a different sense-making of that coffee cup than mine. In fact, I would want to learn about it. And we do that through conversation.
He often used the difference that makes a difference. The difference that makes a difference is a way in which to define something in terms of its relationships, using contrast and context instead of isolating it with a name.
The difference between this and this is not, of course, in this. It's not in that. It's not in the space between them. I can't pinch it. And where is it? And the difference in this and this, you know, is not moved when I move this one.
If the world is made of relationships, how can we describe one thing from another? And that was a question that Gregory was focusing on, and why he used the difference that makes a difference as a way of describing contrast and creating a process of defining the relationships between things.
It's a tool that leads us to look for things in a different way. Instead of looking at the substance of it, looking at the parts and saying, what made this part, what made that part, and where did the design plan come from that makes those parts work together? One sees in the pattern of their similarities and differences a whole separate kind of patterning process. And I think that was characteristic of his way of looking through the surface to some deeper dimension.
Gregory Basin's ideas in article after article in different areas are giving clues to how to take the elevator up one flight and get on a meta level where you get enormous leverage in your understanding. Mathematics is one method, and other social patterns are another. And just the ability to recognize the same pattern when you see it in two different contexts.
Even the language we speak pushes our minds into particular ways of identifying and defining our world. Adjusting our lens in order to see what might be holding systems together is a radical step toward threading the world back together from the inside.
The question of what the ideas are that govern how we think about the world, that those ideas again become linked up with how we live in the world, what sort of damage we do to it, what sort of pollution, exploitation, etc., we engage in.
On the other side, through that double twisted, what we called a double bind some years ago, there's another stage of wisdom. Gregory and his colleagues coined the term double bind. The double bind describes a pattern that's like a catch-22, an experience in which there seems to be no solution for escape. The story Gregory used sometimes to explain the double bind was about the gnat in Through the Looking Glass.
And the gnat is a still small voice explaining the insects of Through the Looking Glass land to Alice. We don't have butterflies, we have bread and butterflies. And the bread and butterfly has wings of very thin slices of bread and butter and a head made of a lump of sugar. Alice says, what does it live on? And that says weak tea with cream in it. Alice saw a difficulty. So she said, what happens if it can't find any? The gnat says, it dies. Alice says, that must happen rather often. The gnat says, it always happens. The double bind in which the bread and butterfly finds himself, namely that if he gets his food, his head dissolves in it. Therefore, his only hope of survival is not to find any food, but then he starves. And this is, you see, a formal double bind of the simplest kind.
I was told that ulcers were things that you got when you worried. So immediately, I was kind of a weird guy as a kid. I thought, oh my God, what the heck will I do if I start to worry about ulcers?
We are in a double bind in the sense that we have growing inequality, and the answer by the political leadership is to grow the economy faster. But as we grow the economy faster, it seems to exacerbate the inequality, and it's also having tremendous impacts on global climate and on the environment itself. So the answer is more, and yet clearly there needs to be some qualitative shift. And in order to see that it's time for a qualitative shift, it would take extraordinary vision and imagination, because slowing the economy creates immediate unemployment, pain, suffering, and political backlash.
The double bind is a creative imperative. It's the moment when because this doesn't work and that doesn't work, something else is going to have to be improvised. A creative impulse is necessary at that moment to get out of the situation, to take it up a level. Can we see a bigger picture? Can we think about the way that we think? Can we see the problems of linear thinking in a world made up of circles? Einstein said, "No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it." My dad asked, what pattern connects the crab to the lobster and the orchid to the primrose, and all the four of them to me, and me to you?
He often talked about this, and he never answered it. It became sort of the big Bateson puzzle. Now, if you look at those things he mentions, the crab, the lobster, the orchid, the primrose, and two human beings, what do they have in common? Obviously, they're living organisms, they're living beings. What is the pattern of organization that is common to all living beings?
You might say looking beyond the surface and looking for the principles behind something. That becomes, I think, the general description of much of what he does when he looks at nature. He recognizes that by looking at the patterns, at the regularities in nature, the redundancies, the similarities of things, but recognizing that it's always theme with variation. The combination of theme and variation immediately points you to something behind it, a formative principle.
He was often accused of talking in riddles and never coming to the point. The question he posed, what is the pattern that connects, was never meant to be answered, because the patterns are changing. It was the act of questioning that he was pushing for, knowing that the eyes behind that curiosity will be the most apt to give the patterns of connection room to wiggle as they perpetually self-correct, and to see the beauty in that process.
When you see process, you see constant change. So that's why Gregory was constantly quoting Heraclitus. You know, Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, said, "No man can step into the same river twice," because it's flowing. And by the same token, maybe you can't kiss the same person twice. You can't pick up the same baby twice.
A man walking is never in balance, but always correcting for imbalance. Growing up in California, I learned that in an earthquake, the kind of structures that last are the ones that have enough flexibility to allow for the ground to shift. That was the same sort of architecture that Gregory tried to develop in his students' thinking skills. Those moments of being able to say, I used to think it was like this, but I'm starting to think it might be like this. That was a way of saying, I learned something. So there wasn't any sort of concrete value placed on the stability of an opinion. In fact, it was just the opposite.
It's like an acrobat. He's walking on a high wire, and he's got a balancing stick. Now, whenever he feels himself fall over that way, he does this with his balancing stick, pushing this side down, raising this side, and thereby gets a little bit of torsion in his own body.